September 3, 1945. Angel Island, San Francisco Bay. The fog rolls in thick and cold across the water, muting the distant sounds of a city celebrating victory. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Nakamura stands in the morning mist outside a wooden barracks, his uniform stripped of insignia, his sword long since surrendered. He has not slept. For 3 days since his capture aboard a disabled submarine off the California coast, he has waited for the bullet, the beating, the torture that he knows must come. He was taught at the Naval Academy in Iwo that capture meant dishonor worse than death. He was told that Americans were barbarians who would desecrate prisoners, that mercy was a Western lie, that the only honorable path for a captured officer was suicide. But the bullet has not come. Neither has the beating. Instead, this morning, an American officer, a Navy captain with gray in his hair and campaign ribbons on his chest, approaches Nakamura and offers him something impossible. He offers him a cigarette. Not as mockery or prelude to interrogation, but as one officer to another. The American lights it for him, then lights his own. They stand together in the fog, smoking in silence, while Nakamura's mind struggles to reconcile what he was taught with what he is experiencing. This moment, this small, quiet gesture between enemies, contains within it a story that would shatter the ideological foundations of thousands of Japanese officers. It is the story of men raised in a culture that venerated honor above life, discovering that their captors possessed a different kind of honor entirely. It is the story of prisoners who expected death and found dignity instead. It is the story of how the simple act of being treated as human beings could transform warriors into witnesses to a truth their empire had tried desperately to conceal. To understand the shock these men experienced, we must first understand what they believed, what they had been taught to expect, and why the reality they encountered was so profoundly destabilizing. Sound of wind through cherry blossoms, distant temple bells. Toshio Nakamura was born in 1918 in Hiroshima, the third son of a family with military service stretching back to the samurai era. He entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Iwo at 16, one of 300 young men selected from thousands of applicants. The academy was not merely a military school. It was a forge for the soul, designed to hammer boys into instruments of the emperor's will. The training was brutal beyond anything Western militaries contemplated. Cadets were beaten daily. They were forced to stand at attention for hours in the cold until men collapsed. They were deprived of sleep, subjected to psychological abuse, taught that their individual lives held no value except in service to the nation and the emperor. And they were taught very specific lessons about the enemy they would face. American sailors, their instructors explained, were products of a weak and decadent civilization. They loved comfort more than duty. They valued individual life over national glory. They would surrender rather than fight to the death. They were racially inferior, mongrels from a mongrel nation, incapable of the spiritual strength that made Japanese warriors invincible. But more than this, Nakamura and his classmates were taught something darker and more consequential. They were taught that Americans were cruel, that they tortured prisoners, that capture by American forces meant mutilation, degradation, and death. This was not presented as propaganda but as established fact, supported by carefully selected examples and doctored evidence. Japanese military training manuals included graphic descriptions of alleged American atrocities. Officers lectured on the savagery that awaited any Japanese soldier unfortunate enough to be captured alive. The purpose of this indoctrination was brutally simple: to ensure that Japanese forces would fight to the death rather than surrender. Dead men could not provide intelligence to the enemy. Dead men could not reveal operational plans or troop dispositions. Dead men could not witness the reality of American POW camps and return to contradict the propaganda. The myth of American barbarity was essential to maintaining Japanese fighting spirit, and so it was taught as gospel truth to every man who wore the uniform. Nakamura believed it completely. When his submarine was damaged by depth charges and forced to surface, when American destroyers surrounded them and demanded surrender, his first instinct was to find his sidearm and end his life honorably. Several of his crew succeeded in this final act. But Nakamura hesitated, and in that hesitation was captured, pulled from the water by American sailors who treated his wounds and wrapped him in blankets and gave him hot soup. Even then, shivering in shock on the deck of an American destroyer, he expected the real treatment to begin once they reached port. The kindness was temporary, he told himself. A trick. Once the Americans had what they wanted from him, the torture would start. It never did. sound of typewriter keys, paper shuffling, footsteps on wood floors. The American detention system for Japanese prisoners of war was built on a foundation of international law, military regulation, and a philosophical commitment to human dignity that Japanese officers found genuinely incomprehensible. The Geneva Conventions, which Japan had signed but never ratified, required that prisoners of war be treated humanely, protected from violence and intimidation, provided with adequate food and shelter, and allowed to maintain their dignity as soldiers who had fought honorably even in defeat. The United States took these obligations seriously. Not perfectly. No system involving human beings ever operates perfectly, but systematically and institutionally. American military law required that POW camp commanders adhere to Geneva Convention standards. The Red Cross was granted access to inspect facilities. Prisoners were allowed to write letters home. Officers were segregated from enlisted men and given quarters appropriate to their rank. Most significantly, a deliberate effort was made to treat prisoners with respect, even when those prisoners had recently been trying to kill Americans. The reasons for this policy were both practical and philosophical. Practically, treating prisoners well encouraged surrender, which saved American lives and provided valuable intelligence. Philosophically, American military culture was rooted in traditions that valued military honor, professional respect between warriors, and the fundamental belief that even enemies possessed human dignity that should not be violated. For Japanese officers entering this system, the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura was processed at Angel Island, then transferred to a larger facility at Camp Tracy in Byron, California. At each stage, he watched for the moment when the mask would slip, when the Americans would reveal their true barbarity. Instead, he was issued clean clothing. He was given 3 meals a day: rice, vegetables, fish, sometimes meat. He was assigned to quarters with other officers, provided with bedding and basic toiletries. He was addressed by his rank. When he reported a medical issue, lingering effects from near drowning, he was taken to an infirmary and treated by American doctors who showed professional courtesy and competence. The cigarette became his measuring stick for impossible reality. Every day, American guards would offer cigarettes to Japanese prisoners. Not as a reward for cooperation or a payment for information, but simply as a routine courtesy, the way one soldier might offer another a smoke during a lull in duty. To Nakamura, raised in a military culture where subordinates were beaten for minor infractions and prisoners were considered worthless, this small gesture represented something beyond his experience. It suggested that Americans viewed captured enemies not as subhuman refuse but as fellow warriors worthy of basic military courtesy. Sound of wind through wire fence. Distant conversations in Japanese. The documentary evidence of prisoner treatment comes from multiple sources, each corroborating the others in ways that remove doubt about the fundamental reality. American military records, preserved in the National Archives, detail the operations of POW camps across the United States. Japanese prisoner testimonies, collected by American intelligence and later by Japanese researchers, provide first-hand accounts. Red Cross inspection reports offer third-party verification. Together, they paint a picture that contradicts nearly everything Japanese military propaganda had claimed. Camp Tracy, where Nakamura spent his first months of captivity, was a specialized interrogation facility designed to extract intelligence from high-value prisoners. One might expect such a facility to employ harsh methods. Instead, Camp Tracy pioneered what would later be called rapport-based interrogation. Japanese-speaking American officers, many of them Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans whose loyalty to the United States never wavered despite facing discrimination at home, would engage prisoners in conversation. They would ask about families, backgrounds, pre-war lives. They would play Go and Shogi. They would discuss Japanese literature and history with knowledge and respect that shocked prisoners who expected their captors to be ignorant barbarians. Only after establishing relationships built on respect would interrogators ask about military matters. And even then, the approach was conversational rather than coercive. Prisoners who refused to answer were not tortured or beaten. They were simply returned to general detention, treated well, and approached again later. This method proved far more effective than brutality would have been. Prisoners, disarmed by unexpected kindness and respect, often volunteered information they would have died rather than reveal under torture. Captain Kazuo Sakamaki, the first Japanese POW captured in World War II after his midget submarine grounded during the Pearl Harbor attack, later wrote extensively about his experience. His memoir, published in Japan after the war, describes his profound confusion at American treatment. I expected to be executed immediately. When I was not executed, I expected to be tortured. When I was not tortured, I expected to be starved and humiliated. Instead, I was given food, shelter, and medical care. I was addressed as Captain by my captors. When I refused to provide information, I was not beaten but simply returned to my quarters. The kindness was harder to endure than cruelty would have been, because it meant that everything I had been taught about Americans was a lie. This realization, that the fundamental premises on which they had built their worldview were false, created a psychological crisis among Japanese officer prisoners that American interrogators learned to recognize and carefully navigate. These men had sacrificed everything for beliefs that were now revealed as propaganda. They had sent their men to die based on lies about the enemy. They had chosen military service over civilian life, endured years of brutal training, accepted death as preferable to capture, all in service of an ideology that could not survive contact with reality. Sound of baseball bat hitting ball, cheering, American swing music. As the war progressed and the number of Japanese prisoners increased, slowly at first, then in growing numbers as American advances cut off Japanese garrisons and made surrender more practical than suicidal resistance, the detention camp system expanded. Facilities were established across the American interior: Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Montana. The choice of inland locations was partly practical. Escape was nearly impossible from camps surrounded by hundreds of miles of unfamiliar terrain, but also humane, protecting prisoners from potential vigilante violence in coastal areas where anti-Japanese sentiment ran high following Pearl Harbor. What Japanese prisoners encountered in these camps continued to shatter their expectations. They were allowed to form self-governing committees to manage internal affairs. They were provided with materials for traditional crafts. They were permitted to maintain military discipline and hierarchy among themselves. They had access to baseball equipment, musical instruments, books in Japanese. Some camps organized English language classes. Prisoners were employed in agricultural work and paid small wages that they could spend in camp canteens on tobacco, candy, and personal items. Colonel Takeo Mori, a senior army officer captured in the Philippines in 1945, was transferred to Camp Clarinda in Iowa. His initial weeks in detention were spent in a state of near catatonic despair, not from harsh treatment but from the psychological weight of survival when honor demanded death. Then one afternoon, an American lieutenant colonel, the camp commandant, invited Mori to his office. Through an interpreter, the American explained that he too had served in the Philippines, commanding troops in Bataan. He had fought against Japanese forces, had lost men to Japanese tactics and brutality. He had every personal reason to hate the enemy he was now charged with guarding. But he would not permit that hatred to violate his duty or his principles. Japanese prisoners under his command would be treated according to military law and the Geneva Conventions. They would be treated as soldiers, not animals. Any American guard who mistreated a prisoner would face court-martial. This was not mercy, the commandant explained. It was not forgiveness for what Japan had done. It was simply the requirement of law and the standard to which American military personnel were held. Then the commandant offered Colonel Mori a cigarette. Mori accepted it, and in accepting understood something profound. The cigarette was not a peace offering or an act of friendship. It was a symbol of professional military courtesy, the acknowledgement of shared service in a profession that transcended national allegiance. The American officer hated what Japan had done but respected the uniform Mori had worn. He could separate the warrior from the war, the man from the ideology that had sent him into battle. This distinction, between hating the enemy and respecting the enemy soldier, was foreign to Japanese military culture. The Imperial Army and Navy taught absolute hatred of all things American. The enemy was not merely to be defeated but degraded, stripped of humanity, treated as vermin to be exterminated. Japanese troops committed atrocities across Asia not despite their training but because of it, because they had been taught that non-Japanese lives held no value, that prisoners were cowards unworthy of life, that mercy was weakness. To encounter Americans who had fought them without hatred, who could respect Japanese military professionalism while opposing Japanese aggression, who could separate the soldier from his nation's crimes, this forced Japanese officers to confront questions their training had never prepared them to answer. Sound of pen on paper, pages turning. The letters Japanese prisoners were allowed to send home, subject to censorship for military intelligence but otherwise unrestricted, provide remarkable documentation of their transformation. These letters, preserved in various archives, show the evolution of thinking as men who expected death gradually accepted survival and began to process what they were experiencing. Lieutenant Hiroshi Kimura, a naval aviator shot down over the Pacific and recovered by American forces, wrote to his family in early 1945, "I am alive, though I have no right to be. I should have died for the Emperor, but I was captured instead. I expected Americans to treat me as our forces have treated captured enemies. I expected no mercy because I deserved none. Instead, I am given food and shelter. I am addressed with respect. I do not understand this, and my shame at survival is compounded by confusion at the kindness of my captors. Perhaps they are merely saving me for later punishment. I do not know. I do not know anything anymore." 6 months later, Kimura wrote again, "I must tell you something that will be difficult to believe. The Americans have treated me better than our own officers treated us before the war. I am not beaten. I am not starved. I am not forced to stand in the cold until I collapse. When I was ill, I was taken to a doctor. When I had questions, they were answered honestly. I am given cigarettes, though I am a prisoner. I am given books to read, though I could provide nothing in return. I do not know how to reconcile this with what we were taught. Perhaps we were not taught the truth." The cigarette appears again and again in these letters and testimonies, a small object freighted with enormous symbolic weight. In Japanese military culture, tobacco was a controlled commodity, given or withheld as reward and punishment. Officers smoked freely while enlisted men went without. Subordinates could not smoke in the presence of superiors. The act of smoking carried significance related to hierarchy, status, and power. For Americans to offer cigarettes to prisoners, to enemies who had recently been trying to kill them, represented a radical egalitarianism that Japanese officers found philosophically challenging. It suggested that Americans viewed all soldiers, regardless of nationality or current circumstances, as sharing something fundamental. It suggested that the uniform created obligations that transcended politics and ideology. It suggested that warriors on opposite sides of a conflict could still recognize each other as warriors, deserving of basic courtesy and respect. Sound of steam whistle, train wheels on tracks. Not all Japanese prisoners responded to their treatment with acceptance or transformation. Some remained hostile, refusing to cooperate, clinging to imperial ideology even as evidence mounted against it. Some formed resistance cells within camps, attempting to maintain aggressive posture and threatening violence against prisoners who seemed too cooperative with Americans. In a few cases, hardcore loyalists murdered fellow prisoners suspected of collaborating, enforcing through violence the code that said death was preferable to survival in enemy hands. But increasingly, as the war drew to its inevitable conclusion and news filtered into camps about the devastation of Japanese cities under American bombing, about the Soviet entry into the Pacific War, about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even the most committed ideologues began to crack. The evidence was overwhelming. Japan had lost. The divine wind had not blown. The emperor was not invincible. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was revealed as a colonial enterprise no different from the Western imperialism it claimed to oppose. And Americans, who were supposed to be inferior barbarians, had demonstrated industrial, military, and organizational superiority that could not be denied. Major General Yoshio Tsunoda, one of the highest-ranking Japanese army officers captured during the war, spent the final months of the conflict in detention at Fort McDowell on Angel Island. He maintained rigid military bearing and refused most interrogation attempts. But he also observed everything. He noted the efficiency of American operations. He watched how American soldiers treated each other and their prisoners. He received newspapers and magazines that showed American productivity, American technological advancement, American democratic debate even in the midst of total war. In September 1945, after the Emperor's surrender broadcast, Tsunoda requested a meeting with the American general overseeing West Coast POW operations. Through an interpreter, Tsunoda delivered a statement that was recorded and preserved. "I spent my entire adult life preparing to fight Americans. I studied your military history. I analyzed your tactics. I believed I understood your weaknesses. But I did not understand the fundamental source of your strength. You fight not from fear of punishment or worship of a divine ruler. You fight for ideas, for freedom, for democracy, for the belief that individuals possess value independent of their service to the state. These ideas make you stronger than we anticipated. And they make you treat prisoners better than we treated our own soldiers. I am humbled by this, and shamed, and forced to reconsider everything I believed." Then General Tsunoda asked for a cigarette. The American general gave him one, and they smoked together while the sun set over San Francisco Bay and the war that had killed millions finally ended. Sound of wind, distant foghorn. The statistical evidence supports the testimonial accounts. Of approximately 41,000 Japanese military personnel held in POW camps in the United States during World War II, the death rate was less than 1%, extraordinarily low for wartime detention, lower than the mortality rate of American troops in some theaters, comparable to the civilian death rate in the United States during the same period. The primary causes of death among Japanese prisoners were natural illness and accidents, not mistreatment or deliberate neglect. Compare this to the experience of Allied prisoners in Japanese hands. Of approximately 132,000 Allied POWs held by Japan, nearly 28,000 died in captivity, a death rate over 20%. The causes were starvation, disease exacerbated by malnutrition, summary execution, slave labor under inhuman conditions, and deliberate abuse. The Bataan Death March. The Burma Railway. The Sandakan Death March. The Hell Ships. Unit 731. Japanese forces systematically violated every standard of humane treatment, not because of logistical failure but because of ideological belief that prisoners deserved no mercy and non-Japanese lives had no value. The contrast was not lost on Japanese prisoners who, after the war, learned what their forces had done to Allied captives. The psychological burden of this knowledge, that they had been treated with dignity by an enemy their nation had treated barbarically, created profound guilt and cognitive dissonance that some men never resolved. Some became advocates for peace and reconciliation, speaking publicly about their experiences to challenge the nationalist narratives that led Japan into catastrophic war. Others retreated into silence, unable to reconcile what they had experienced with what they knew their comrades had done. Sound of pages turning, distant thunder. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, who accepted that first cigarette in the fog on Angel Island, spent 15 months in American detention. He was interrogated extensively about submarine operations, tactics, and technology. He provided some information, technical details that he judged would not endanger Japanese personnel, but refused to discuss operational plans or intelligence matters. The Americans did not punish his refusal. They simply moved on to other topics, maintaining their professional courtesy throughout. In April 1946, Nakamura was repatriated to Japan aboard an American transport ship. He returned to a nation utterly transformed, occupied by the very forces he had fought, governed under a constitution written by Americans, stripped of military power and imperial pretension. He found Hiroshima, his home city, reduced to radioactive rubble. He found his family scattered, his father dead in the final months of the war, his brother missing in Manchuria, his mother surviving in a refugee camp. He also found a nation struggling with the same questions that had tormented him in detention. How had everything they believed proven false? How had the invincible empire been defeated so thoroughly? How had the Americans they were taught to despise proven more humane than their own commanders? What did it mean to have sacrificed everything for a cause revealed as bankrupt? Nakamura spent the next 4 decades trying to answer these questions. He became a teacher, instructing post-war Japanese youth about navigation and maritime history, never speaking directly about his wartime service but quietly undermining the militarist mythology that had led his generation to ruin. He wrote a private memoir, published only after his death, that described his capture and detention in detail. The memoir returns again and again to the symbol of the cigarette, the small gesture that contained within it an entire philosophy of human dignity that Japanese military culture had rejected. In one passage, Nakamura writes, "We were taught that Americans were barbarians, and we believed it because it confirmed our superiority. When they treated us with respect, we did not know how to respond. Some men clung to ideology, insisting that American courtesy was deception or weakness. But I could not maintain that fiction. The evidence was too clear. Americans fed us when we were hungry. They healed us when we were sick. They allowed us to maintain our dignity even in defeat. They did this not because they were soft, but because they were strong, strong enough to treat enemies as human beings deserving of basic respect. This strength, rooted in democratic values and legal principles, defeated us more completely than any weapon. We lost the war on the battlefield, but we lost the ideological contest in the detention camps, where American soldiers proved daily that everything we had been taught about them was a lie. Sound of wind chimes, distant city traffic. The story of Japanese officers stunned by respect in American detention camps is not a story of American moral superiority. The United States was, during the same period, interning its own Japanese American citizens in camps that, while not comparable to the brutality of Axis detention systems, represented a profound betrayal of democratic principles. American forces in the Pacific Theater sometimes killed Japanese prisoners rather than evacuating them, sometimes mutilated Japanese dead for souvenirs, sometimes fought with a racial hatred that mirrored Japanese racism. The firebombing of Japanese cities and the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki raised moral questions that persist decades later. But it is a story about the power of legal frameworks and institutional values. The United States had established, through law and military regulation, standards for prisoner treatment that most American personnel followed most of the time. These standards were not always honored. No standard in war ever is, but they existed, they were taught, they were enforced through military justice, and they shaped behavior in ways that produced systematically different outcomes than the systems Japanese forces operated under. The cigarette, offered from captor to captive, American to Japanese, victor to vanquished, represented the possibility that even enemies could recognize each other's humanity. It represented the idea that soldiers on opposite sides of an ideological conflict might still share professional military courtesy. It represented a philosophy of warfare that distinguished between defeating an enemy and degrading an enemy, between winning a war and destroying the humanity of those who fought it. For Japanese officers raised in a culture that taught absolute obedience, racial superiority, and contempt for captured enemies, this simple gesture was revolutionary. It challenged every premise on which their military service had been based. It forced them to confront the possibility that their own nation's ideology was morally bankrupt, that the enemy they had fought was more honorable than their own commanders, that the war they had sacrificed everything for had been waged in service of lies. Sound of ocean waves, seabirds calling. There is a photograph, taken in August 1945 at a detention camp in Arizona, that captures something essential about this story. It shows an American Army captain and a Japanese naval commander standing together, both smoking cigarettes, both looking away from the camera toward something in the distance. The American is young, 25 perhaps, with the casual confidence of a man raised in freedom. The Japanese officer is older, maybe 40, his bearing still military correct despite months in captivity. They are not speaking in the photograph. They are simply standing together, two warriors in temporary truce, sharing tobacco and silence. The photograph was taken by a Red Cross inspector documenting camp conditions. It was filed in a routine report and forgotten for decades. But it was rediscovered in archives and published in a Japanese historical journal in the 1980s, where it provoked intense reaction. Some Japanese commentators criticized the officer for fraternizing with the enemy. Others saw in the image something profound, the moment when ideology gave way to human recognition, when warriors on opposite sides acknowledged their shared profession and mutual respect despite everything that had divided them. The cigarette in that photograph is more than tobacco wrapped in paper. It is a symbol of the democratic values that Americans carried into battle, the belief that even enemies possessed rights and dignity that should not be violated. It is a symbol of the legal frameworks that constrained American conduct, the Geneva Conventions and military regulations that created accountability even in war's chaos. Sound of ocean waves, seabirds calling. There is a photograph, taken in August 1945 at a detention camp in Arizona, that captures something essential about this story. It shows an American Army captain and a Japanese naval commander standing together, both smoking cigarettes, both looking away from the camera toward something in the distance. The American is young, 25 perhaps, with the casual confidence of a man raised in freedom. The Japanese officer is older, maybe 40, his bearing still military correct despite months in captivity. They are not speaking in the photograph. They are simply standing together, two warriors in temporary truce, sharing tobacco and silence. The photograph was taken by a Red Cross inspector documenting camp conditions. It was filed in a routine report and forgotten for decades. But it was rediscovered in archives and published in a Japanese historical journal in the 1980s, where it provoked intense reaction. Some Japanese commentators criticized the officer for fraternizing with the enemy. Others saw in the image something profound, the moment when ideology gave way to human recognition, when warriors on opposite sides acknowledged their shared profession and mutual respect despite everything that had divided them. The cigarette in that photograph is more than tobacco wrapped in paper. It is a symbol of the democratic values that Americans carried into battle, the belief that even enemies possessed rights and dignity that should not be violated. It is a symbol of the legal frameworks that constrained American conduct, the Geneva Conventions and military regulations that created accountability even in war's chaos. It is a symbol of the power of small gestures to challenge and transform worldviews built on hatred and dehumanization. And it is a symbol of the ultimate weapon in ideological warfare, not propaganda or indoctrination, but simple, consistent demonstration of principles through action. Japanese prisoners were not converted to American democracy through speeches or lessons. They were converted by being treated with the respect that democracy says all humans deserve, and by recognizing that this respect came from strength, not weakness.